So somebody recently said to me, why didn't the councils do anything about it when they understood that this was happening? Is it because they were afraid of being called a racist? And I went, well, yeah, that's the surface level headline reason. But then you have to ask yourself, well, why were people scared of being called a racist, right? If you're not a racist and you have evidence that this is actually happening, both of which were true, in a country in which is running properly and which the courts are honest and the police are honest, then you would take the evidence and you would give it to the police and courts and you would say, look, I'm not a racist. Here's the evidence, prosecute those guys. So first of all, it tells you that we don't have honest police and courts because they were afraid that that wouldn't happen. They didn't feel that they could rely on the courts to exonerate them from this charge of racism. Secondly, why has the word racist become so toxic, right? This is a question that nobody has really asked yet, as far as I'm aware, and no one really has a good answer to. Now, some of it is going to be to do with like the neo-Marxist woke nonsense. Some of it is going to be to do with like the open societies. We came out of this World War II where everybody realized that how badly wrong racism can go and what the consequences can be. So let's like shy away from that as far as we can get. So a lot of it's like cultural. Some of it is to do with like guilt. They were white guilt. They were sort of white guilting people into things. So again, it's a very complex problem, right? It's not just they were afraid of being called racist. There's like layers and layers behind that charge that all led to these girls being ignored. And so an inquiry can't dig into those layers, but an archive can, because we can build up a full picture of exactly what happened from all angles and then spend decades pulling those threads apart again. So ultimately it's an academic project, but academic in the best sense, in that we're really trying to fully understand everything we can about what happened here. And ultimately, if I do my job right with this archive, or we do our jobs right with this archive, what I actually want to foment is total societal change, right? If we get the answers to these questions, then we can say, we don't just need like a new law that says grooming is bad. We need to radically rethink from the bottom up, like academia, the part that the universities played in promoting white guilt and woke nonsense. We need to radically rethink our whole local government structure, because clearly right now it's allowing a lot of corruption to go on. We need to totally rethink policing and how that works, because again, right now it's allowing corruption. So, the reason that I so want to do this project and that I'm so almost evangelical about getting to the root of the grooming gangs is because it touches everything in our lives that has gone wrong in this country. All of us suffer because the police are corrupt, because it means that when your house is burgled, they don't come out to see you. All of us suffer because the councils are corrupt, because the roads are being left to go into ruin, So it is the key to unlocking everything that this country has become that's bad and getting it back to being in a place where we can live free, open and honest lives again.
Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the World of Most podcast. And on this episode of Reflections and Reactions, we have Donna with us, Donna Rachel Edmonds with us. And before we get into our topic, which will be about the National Archive for Survivors of Grooming and Rape Gangs in Britain, we are going to talk to Donna about who she is, her life, a recap of her life story, just to get to know her before we get into our topic. So, hi there, Donna. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you.
I'm good. So, yeah, floor is yours. Tell us your
Floor is
life
mine.
story.
My whole life story.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, born in 1981. My parents, it is slightly relevant. My parents, my dad is British, English.
Hmm.
My mother is Russian Jewish. So she came to the country in 1974 when she was about 12 years old. And they met when they were teenagers. They had me when they were teenagers. They got married at the age of 18. And so I was born into a very working class neighborhood. Place called Lee Park in Portsmouth, which is like the area you don't want to live in. And none of Portsmouth is that nice, right? And then they got divorced. We moved to London. We moved to Sussex. You know, we sort of moved around a lot. But but then I had like a sort of childhood of two halves, right? So we went from kind of very working class. As I say, I lived in London in a very inner city kind of place. I remember in my first year of junior school, one of the teachers said, they asked everybody in the class to give the word for hello in the language that they speak at home. And there were, I think, 30 kids in the class and 30 different words for hello. So it was very, like mixed, multicultural. And then when I was about 9 or 10, we moved down to Sussex to a market town, it was like stepping back in time into the 1950s. Like we had a 4-digit phone number, and one of the kids in my class was brought to school by pony and cart, right? So I went from like, you know, sort of slum 1980s to like halcyon 1950s in sort of overnight, which was really weird. And then got a assisted place at private school. So again, like, working class family, but surrounded by, like, all my best friends had ponies and, would go skiing for their holidays and stuff. But what it kind of gave me was this ability to kind of see across different
Mm.
sections of the culture and our society, and to be just as comfortable from one to the other. I'm happy to walk into the House of Lords and talk to them, and then
Mm.
I'd go home and see my aunts and cousins, and we'll all be playing snooker down the pool hall, whatever, snooker hall. So, um, and being a relatively intelligent person, I just watch and see what's going on and try and figure out like where the heck we live and what weird times this is and all that kind of stuff. So very inquiring mind. Well, then what happened? So in my 20s, I started working in politics. I've always been very interested in making a difference in the world. I'm not particularly money motivated, so I was never really that bothered about becoming a CEO or, having a lot of cash. But I sort of wanted to make a difference. So I started off in politics in my 20s, um, managed to land a job at the European Parliament. And I sort of say to people, like, and I think this is true, I didn't know that there was a European Parliament until I got a job there. Right? I was completely like politically naive. I had to choose between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems when I joined a party, and I actually read both of their manifestos to see which would be the better fit. Um,
Who did you
so
choose?
I went for the Conservatives because I kind of felt that the Conservatives had more of a focus on like personal responsibility.
Mm.
Um, but they're
Yeah.
actually like at their heart, they're not wildly different as parties because the Conservatives kind of brought a lot of liberalism into
Yeah.
their party,
Mm.
Um, but that was a really interesting. So I did a year and a half with a guy called Roger Helmer, who was an MEP there, and he was a fantastic boss because basically he was like, look, this is your chance to learn everything you need to about this game.
Mm.
And so he said, as long as you've done your office work, there's always in the European Parliament, like a lot of events, there are presentations, there are um, lots of like meet and greets and, it's a chance for the lobby. It's mostly a chance for the lobbyists to get to know the staff. But there's a lot of that kind of thing going on, dinners, lunches. So he said, look, you go to any that you want to, anything that takes your fancy. So I basically kind of spent a year and a half like sitting in rooms just trying to learn as much as I could about how European politics worked. And getting a feel for like, how it had come about, what the outcomes were, what the motivations were. So that was really, really interesting. As I say, spent a year and a half there. And then someone sort of said to me, like, so are you staying? And I was like, well, why wouldn't I? And they said, well, if you don't leave now, you'll never be able to leave because
Mm.
your specialism will be the European Parliament. And then you'll only ever be able to get hired by people who want to lobby Brussels.
Mm.
So he said, you have to make a decision. So I thought, well, I don't really want to get stuck here. It's a really weird environment. It's a little bit like being a boarding school because you have like all the nationalities just stick to their own kind. Um, and so it's quite cliquey in a way, they will sit at the same tables at lunch and all that kind of stuff. It's a bit weird in that respect. Like the Germans and the English for some reason got on very well, but there wasn't that much crossover with the French, So so it's a bit of an odd place to live. So I made the decision to come back to the UK. Got myself a job with Therese Coffey, actually, and she had just been elected as the new MP for Suffolk Coastal. This was in 2010, just after that election. And so I spent a year with her, and it was like night and day because Roger Helmer was very much his motivation in getting elected was that he wanted to get us out of Europe. Essentially, he wanted to go there and rabble rouse, and he was a bit of a kind of like Rupert Lowe figure. He wanted to be the guy who was throwing things into the spokes of the wheels to try and stop the whole machine from turning. Therese Coffey wanted to become a minister, right? So she was doing everything that the Cameron government wanted, and she was like, making sure that everything that we said was on message and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of hated it, to be honest. Like, it was a really difficult year for me because I was just like, but all of this stuff is shit. It's not what we're here for. And, the whole office was like, what are we doing? Why? This isn't what we got, what we thought we were signing up for. But anyway, again, it was good experience. I got to know how Westminster works. I got to see how like the political parties play the game. And then I went into journalism. So I got a job with Breitbart. I was kind of headhunted in a way, and spent 3.5 years with them as a journalist. My grandmother was a journalist, so I was sort of taking on the family mantle, really. She was a journalist with the BBC. She had her own show on the BBC Russian World Service. So I actually kind of grew up, like when we were living in London, I remember very vividly like sitting in her office. She made radio shows, but she made them in a time when everything was still done on tape, right?
Mm.
So her editing process was that she would spool the tapes and then she would cut with a
Uh,
razor blade and edit that way. And she was good at it. She was a good journalist. Um, so I enjoy journalism. Like, again, I have that inquiring mind. Like, I always just want to know the why to everything. Like, well, why is this happening? Why are you making that decision? Why are you doing that? And so, I mean, there's not masses of scope for that at sort of entry level journalism because you're mostly just churning out stories as fast as they come. But over the years, I kind of built up. Like, I did a few interesting interviews. I interviewed a guy in Bradford who he was ex-Muslim, and he and his whole family had converted to Christianity, and basically, as you can imagine, it didn't go very well for them living in Bradford.
yeah, I can imagine.
They had like fire, like Molotov cocktails, like shoved through the letterbox while his kids were asleep. He
Not
walked
much
out of
different
his
than Pakistan.
No, I'm sure he walked out of his house one day and these guys just set upon him with baseball bats and put him in the hospital. And he only survived because two Polish guys walked by and were like, "What the heck are you doing?" So that was when I really started to take an interest in, well, the Islamification of Britain would be part of it, but also the grooming gangs as well, because, I was meeting survivors, I was hearing their stories and asking them questions. Like, one of the first questions I asked a survivor when I sat down with her was like, I don't understand why the communities didn't protect their girls, because again, as I said at the beginning, like, so my father's side of the family are very working class. We lived in
Mm.
Portsmouth, and I remember as a very small child, all of the kids would play in the streets, and we always felt safe because we knew that somewhere around, probably unseen by us children, but there would be an adult watching.
Mm.
And if a strange man walked up to the kids who were playing in the streets and started talking to them, within seconds there'd be someone out there like, "Who are you? What do you want? What are you
Mm.
talking to the kids for? Shove off." So I said, I don't get it. Like, why did that not happen? And she said, well, because the police have just decimated these communities. Like, the parents were, and the, I guess, relatives were trying to protect the girls, but the police were coming in and arresting them or telling them, you're not allowed to, it's harassment or whatever it was. So you already you start to get a picture that the state has not just like looked the other way, but has actually actively made it easier for the girls to be groomed or for the gangs to go about their business. Um, so as I say, so that started already. I was interested in the topic. Yeah, and I was jealous of it. I went and lived in Israel for a while. We can talk about that if you want to. I came
No, go on.
back.
Yeah,
Well, I lived in Israel. 2019, I moved out to Jerusalem. And I was working on the Jerusalem Post for about a year, but I found it difficult because it's mainstream news, so I kept having to
yeah.
like edit what I was writing, to try and make
Yeah.
it palatable for the editors. But that again it was very interesting because you have obviously these three major cultures all in the same space, right? The old city of Jerusalem is like a mile square. It's tiny. You can walk across it in I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And you have, half of the old city is Muslim. There's a quarter Jewish and about a quarter Christian. They all have their own little areas. They don't really stray into each other's. In fact, because I'm, secular. I don't follow a religion, so I was quite happy walking around the whole city. And I went one day down one of the Muslim streets, and a guy actually in the shop sort of like caught my sleeve and said, "Hey, you can't go down there." And I was like, "Why? Why? What's going on?" He said, "Well, that's Muslim. You're a Christian, right?" I was like, "No." He went, "Oh, well, just be careful." But so there's like they kind of self-segregate really closely. Like you're allowed to walk there technically, but they don't. They don't. They like to keep it their own. So it gave me again, like I was really kind of following like the Palestinian Israeli fight, and just noticing how much of it, especially when I came back actually in 2023, the resonances with what's going on in this country are huge. So one of the arguments I have quite regularly with people on Twitter is they say, well, it's not our fight. Like, if Israel and Palestine want to have an argument, what is it to us? It's a foreign war. Let's stay out of it. They can have their fight. And I keep trying to explain, and people don't really understand. I'm like, it's not, because we're having the same fight here.
Yeah.
And you can tell that because there are Palestinian flags all over our streets,
Yeah.
right? So even if we don't think of it as our fight, the people who are on the side of Palestine definitely think of it as
Yeah.
something that involves the West.
And the consequences of the outcomes of that war are represented over here. Like if the Palestinians have an advantage, or if they win or anything of that sort, that it emboldens all the Islamists over here, and their line of funding keeps on going. That's why,
Yeah.
when people were arguing about, oh, I don't care what happens in Iran, and whatever Israel does, like, no, actually it's a good thing what Israel is doing in Iran, because it's cutting out the funding that is coming into Britain for the
Yeah.
Islamists. Not even if you think about as your own personal interest, as own British personal interest, it's actually good that they are
Yeah.
doing our dirty work. So
Yeah,
people don't
absolutely.
get it.
But also like even to a more fundamental level, like if you look at Hamas have put out propaganda documents in English.
Hmm.
And if you read
For a
them, they
reason,
read
yeah.
like students' union kind of
Hmm.
materials. They're really, really like, our struggle is the struggle of the people, and, we must overthrow the oppressors. Like it's basically neo-Marxist
Yeah.
claptrap, basically. But they speak very much the same language. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded by a guy who explicitly looked at what Mussolini and Hitler were doing and were like, hey, we can do
Hmm.
that as
Yeah.
Muslims. So it's very tied into European
Mhm.
ideologies. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
nationalist movement, and this
Yeah.
whole nationalist fervor was kind of, again, something that was very big in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, right?
Hmm.
And that's where it comes from. So, so it's not a totally foreign culture that's being imported. Like it's completely part of us. It's
Yeah.
part of our national, well, international, but
Hmm.
regional kind of conflict. And again, like living in Jerusalem really brought this home because obviously that's where the Crusades mostly happened.
Hmm.
And you start to see this conflict in terms of the Crusades. The jihadis very much think that they're still fighting the Crusades in those
Yeah.
terms, and against the same people. And where did all the Crusaders come from? They were coming from Britain, France,
Hmm.
Italy, a little, but it was that kind of thing. So yeah, it gives you a much longer kind of time span of seeing the conflict, and also a much larger geographical region. It's not just a little war that's happening in the Middle East that has
Hmm.
nothing to do with us. It's part of our history. We have
Yeah.
Crusader history. So yeah. And then again, bringing it back to the grooming gangs, that's part of that as well. The fact that they, one of the guys on our team, Jonathan, talks about it as not as grooming gangs or rape gangs, but as slave trading.
Yeah,
Sexual slave trading. And if you look at what ISIS did when they, captured the Yazidis, they were doing the exact same thing.
yeah.
They were grabbing the girls and
It's
just using them.
theological and political, like all combined in it. It can't be just viewed as in isolation from like, oh, these are just bad apples.
Right,
There's a whole spectrum to it. But
right, right.
also tell us about you becoming a counselor as well, and
Hmm.
um your let's say dispelling from reform.
Okay. Well, that all came about very accidentally. The dog is going to come and say hello.
That's fine.
Um, so I didn't mean to get elected, and I didn't really mean to get expelled from Reform either. But what happened there was that, so when I came back from Israel, obviously I've been working in politics for about 15 years, and everybody said to me, "Are you going to join Reform? Are you going to stand for councillor, or are you going to stand for MP or whatever?"
Hmm.
And I said, no, heck no, yeah, no way. Because after I left to raise coffee, and it was around about the Breitbart years, like between about 2011 to 2015, something like that, I was in UKIP. And I
Hmm.
ran for the European Parliament within UKIP for the Southeast ticket, on the Southeast ticket, which is the same one as Nigel Farage was on. So I was working with him on that campaign. Not that closely, but we were on the same ticket. Um, and UKIP was a really interesting party. It was extremely dysfunctional, in exactly the same way as Reform is extremely dysfunctional, because ultimately Nigel Farage's parties are Nigel Farage ego vehicles, right?
Hmm.
They're cults. So the whole party structure, the whole setup is all designed just to propel him to as far as he can get. And so what we were seeing in UKIP was the same problems as we're having now. There was a lot of just poor management, poor judgment, a lot of naivety, to be honest. Like the local branches are kind of left to they're just told to just get on with it and create results, but they're not told how or given any resources or anything like that. So, and these are all political amateurs who just want to get their country back. So they don't know. So they're just making it up. And they start to infight, and it all like gets a bit silly and a bit local politics. So that was going on, but also the big problem for me was that we were getting situations in which the media were coming after people who were doing well in the party, and then the party wasn't standing by them. They would just throw them under a
Hmm.
bus.
Yeah.
And so, Nigel Farage has said a few times, I don't really demand anything. I just demand loyalty. And I keep saying, but you can't demand loyalty. It's like
Yeah.
demanding respect, right? You have
Yeah.
to earn it by being loyal yourself or being respectful yourself. And he never is. So everybody who gets in his way, even within his own party, like if they're not politically expedient in the moment, not even long term, like because you can have a bad day and come back from it and still be a useful person. But it's just like, right, well, right now we've got a headline, so you're axed, which is just ridiculous. There's no way to run a party. So I already knew that UKIP was like that, and I knew that Reform were going to be like that because it's basically the same party. And so I was saying, there's absolutely no way in hell that I'm getting involved in any of this because it's going to be a shit show. But the 2024 election came around, and, like everyone else, I was like, well, the Conservatives are obviously going to lose and frankly deserve to. Labour are going to be a nightmare. And we need to get them out. And Reform are kind of like they're the best placed at the moment to offer the least worst of the alternatives, right? But I knew that they wouldn't really have anything in the local, any real structure in the local branches. So I wrote to a few of them near me, and I said, look, if I've got lots of political experience, I understand how campaigns work. If you just need a paper candidate to put in on the ballot so that people have an option to vote Reform, you're welcome to take my name. I'll put in the
Hmm.
papers. And they wrote back to me saying, no, it's all right. We've already got someone. I said, okay, well, if you want me to put a few leaflets out, let me know, because I live on like an estate of about 200 houses. And they even said no to that. They were like, no, it's fine, thanks very much. I was like, okay, cool. I didn't think anything more of it. Until about December when I got an email, because I still wasn't a member of the party. Like, I hadn't joined because I knew it was going to be a nightmare. So I got an email from them saying the council elections are coming up in May and we need 74 candidates across the whole of Shropshire. Will you stand? And so I wrote back and I said, well, I'm not a member, but if you need people, I can. And they basically said, yes, please. So I, put my £25 in and filled in the forms and sent them off. And I didn't think that I would get through the vetting because when I was a UKIP councillor, the media played stupid parlour games. So they asked me a question, I gave them an honest answer. They turned it into Donna is a racist, homophobic, bigoted, whatever, and then they published it everywhere. And then UKIP made it worse by saying you have to issue an apology, and I was saying, but I didn't do anything wrong, so I'm not
You
apologising.
admit guilt then, like when there is no guilt to admit.
Yeah, exactly. And the story was dying away, and then they released an apology, and of course it all blew up again for another 3 days. So it was stupid, but because of that, if you Google my name, you'll see articles saying homophobic, bigoted, Nazi or whatever it is. And
This will be the title of this episode, by the way.
thank you. I appreciate that. So, so anyway, because they kept going on and on and on about how rigorous their vetting is and how stringent they are, I was like, well, they're just going to not let me on in the first place. But they did. So, okay, I was like, fine, I'm happy to run. Do you have anything in place? Well, no, they didn't have any data. They don't have any money because the party was holding on to the money until after the election for reasons that weren't exactly clear. They didn't have any volunteers, even though they had about 500 members, but nobody could actually access those members because only one person's allowed to access the account, all this kind of nonsense. And everyone was getting frustrated. And then the Rupert Lowe thing blew up in March. And I talked to my chairman, on WhatsApp. I said, look, this is ridiculous. Like, this is a UKIP all over again. You can't get rid of your best MP. This is just nonsense. I'm quitting. Like, I don't want to be involved in this. And he phoned me up and he said, please, please, please don't, because 2 other people have just quit. I need to find more candidates. It's really difficult. Just do me a favour and file your papers, because I still wasn't an official candidate. So I said, okay, I'll file the papers, and did. And then 2 weeks later, they had the press conference where they were rolling out like all of these, this is the Conservative leader of so-and-so council, but now he's a reformer, and this is a Lib Dem, but now she's a reformer. And I was like, what the heck is this, right? If he's a Conservative leader of his council, clearly he hasn't done anything useful on the council. Why do we want him? Get rid of him. So again, I phoned up my chair and I said, I'm done. Like, this is outrageous and ridiculous. And he again begged me. He was like, please, I can't find anyone else. Just do it, just for the sake of getting us through. And then, you probably won't get elected. You can never see us again if you want to. So I kind of went, all right, fine, just for the sake of making things easier, I'll leave my name on. But I didn't really do that much campaigning. Like, I put a couple of leaflets out, but I made them myself because the ones that they gave me were just like Nigel Farage's face were like all over it. And I didn't really think I'd win. And then the results came in. So this is what actually got me expelled, was that that from 2 or 3 days before the actual election itself, Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib were all over social media saying, don't vote reform, because they're useless and rubbish. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Like, you want people to vote reform because you want people on the councils that could come into a new party if you create one, right? You don't want to fill the councils with Labour and Lib Dem and Tory.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was writing that, and people were saying, well, I'm not voting reform because they're useless. And I said, look, I'll be really honest with you. I'm actually running for them, and I don't like them. I'll probably defect at some point after the election, but just vote for them, right? Just for now, because they're the best thing we've got right now. We can figure it out later. So as I said, I got elected and was like, shit. Now what? because because I was like, well, now I'm going to have to actually work with the party, and
Yeah.
they're a nightmare, and I'm going to have
Yeah.
to watch what I say. So the results came through on Friday. The whole of Saturday, I was like, how can I make myself the leader of the reform group on the council? Because that's the only way I'm going to be able to realistically do what I want to do and
Yeah.
work with these guys. So I invited them all over to my house for a barbecue the following week, and everyone was getting excited. Oh, we can start making videos and do. Then on the Sunday, I woke up and checked my emails, and the first one was, "You've been suspended as a reform councillor because you were telling people to to vote reform, but for the wrong reasons,
Yeah.
So, so, so I wrote back saying, "Okay, I quit because
I mean, you
I was
can't be
getting rid of."
surprised by that, then.
No, I know. Well, I wasn't. I mean, I was surprised I lasted that long, and I knew
Yeah.
that they were going to throw me out sooner or later. So I was like, well, better to get it over with straight
Yeah.
away. Like they've helped me out. I mean, the other thing that they did was during the campaign. Again, like I was tweeting a lot, like Nigel Farage has to go. We can't have him as leader. We need a different person.
Hmm.
And somebody who lives in my local area but works with headquarters was, in headquarters and saw that they were all looking at my tweets and talking about them. And the people who were working in head office wanted to deselect me and get rid of me. And Nigel himself said, no, keep her on. Right. So this person told me this, like, hey, isn't that great? Nigel really likes you. And I was like, no, what is Nigel plotting? Why was he keeping me on? And a week later to the day, the Telegraph phoned me up and said, we're running a story about your tweets. Do you have anything to say? And I was like, no, run what you
Hmm.
want. So it's clear that Reform have been giving the Telegraph and probably other media outlets. Actually, they did it with the BBC as well.
Hmm.
After I left, I sent them an email just to the one guy in Reform saying I quit the party, and then it turned up in the BBC about 2 hours later.
Hmm.
So I'm like, so they're leaking information against their own people to the media.
Yeah, they're very much a lefty organization, isn't it? Like they operate like that.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um. So that was a quick recap,
that was
and
half an
now,
hour.
yeah. Now, but it was interesting. So I want to know. There are few things. There are few things that I found like there are few things that I found similar, and I realize why I like you now.
Okay.
So like my mom's mom, she was Russian,
Hmm.
right? So I have a Russian connection as well,
Cool. Yeah.
and my other Eastern European connection is my wife being Polish, right? So
Right.
I have that. Both my granddad and my mom were journalists, so we
Ah,
have
nice.
that in common as well.
Excellent.
We are both have been interested in politics, but I have forcefully and intentionally kept myself away from politics all my life, like not getting involved that much into politics and journalism as well.
Yeah.
But for some reason, like I just was like, no, this has already been done in my family. I'm not gonna do it again.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but I would like if I didn't do that, I would have followed similar paths, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
So that I found that interesting. That was weird. Like I always find it interesting having that Russian connection, anyways,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
my
yeah,
family.
yeah.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have guessed it about you, but yeah, it's
no,
a
no.
yeah,
No, it's like we did our ancestry sort of thing as well. It came up like a certain percentage Eastern European and a
yeah, yeah.
certain percentage Celtic as well from
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know where. It was like, okay, fine, I'll take
Fair
it.
enough. Yeah.
So now, National Archive for Survivors of Grooming Gangs.
Hmm.
Um, first talk we're both working on it, right? So I am working with you on it as well. For people who don't know about it, the descriptions are like not the descriptions, the website will be in the descriptions. The description will not be in the website. The website
Both.
will be in the description, so you can go over there and support our efforts for building a national archive for grooming gang, for survivors of grooming gangs. But tell us a bit about what it is and how you intend to expand on it, and what do you see it, why is it necessary, why is it needed?
Okay, so the original idea came out of watching actually Tommy Robinson's Rape of Britain documentary, and he was talking to a survivor in Telford, and then he was also talking to the police, he was talking to all sorts of people, confronting people. And I was watching it and I was like, I actually just really want to hear the girl's story. Like, just let her speak for an hour. Like, I really just, that's what I'm interested in. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if somebody just went around and just interviewed all of these girls and then just put the video on YouTube? So that we have in one place dozens and dozens and dozens of stories, and then we can just see what really happened. Like, that's the easiest way to get it out there. And also because one of the things, so I live near Telford, and it's amazing to me how many people still don't know about the grooming gangs in Telford.
Really?
And so I just wanted to like flood social media with like 30-second clips of like, this is what happened to me and it's still going on. So that just to raise awareness that this is not something that, ended with the J report in 2014, but it's still going forward. So that was like the initial like nugget, of an idea. And I started to just mention it to people. Hey, somebody should like just interview all these girls. And people started replying, you actually, also you being one of them, and saying that's a good idea, but you could do a lot more than that. And so now it's like turned into like this massive project. So the nugget of the idea is still there. We're going to create an archive of survivors' testimonies, and I purposefully made it an archive and not inquiry, because an inquiry has a tight remit, right? First of all, you have to do it within a certain time frame because you need to get a report out, and people want the report as quickly as possible. So realistically, you have to do it in a very short time frame. A good inquiry takes like 10 years, right? But people don't want to wait 10 years because it's still going on. So first of all, I thought, well, let's ditch the inquiry model entirely. Oh, and then the other thing is you can only interview a certain number of people because, again, you have a time frame. So you could only, maybe talk to 50 people, and then maybe only 10 of the stories would actually make it into the report, which means that thousands of girls don't get heard from. So I was like, let's ditch the inquiry model entirely. Let's make it an archive that has no end date. So as we record the stories, we release them ad infinitum. Like, if we're releasing these things for the next 30 years, then so be it. And I kind of used instead the model of there's a museum in Jerusalem called Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum. And they have done this, right? They have like a Holocaust project. So they go and interview people who survived, their families, people who were maybe, I don't know, Germans, I guess. I don't know who they interview. And if you go to the museum, like, you'll see the videos that they've put up, but you can also go on their website and watch testimonies and that sort of stuff. And then they also gather all of the material around it. So they'll look for, records kept, what was in the newspapers, whatever, I guess probably army reports or whatever, but anything that they can find, people's diaries they'll take. So that they build up a massive, massive body of knowledge, and then half of it's a really large campus, the museum, because it also includes like a memorial gardens and all that sort of stuff. But half of the campus is just research. So you have people doing PhDs mostly, and other research projects, and they'll be able to come in and look through the archive and use the materials and build up a body of knowledge about how it happened and why it happened and what were the consequences of it happening and all that sort of stuff. And so that's what I wanted ultimately to create with our archive. I want people to be able to look at the historical record of this event, because people kind of fling the term around. Oh yeah, we had these rape gangs or grooming gangs or whatever you want to call them, and they happened, and like some of the girls' lives were ruined, but people think of it as like a few hundred girls here and there, and maybe a few in Oxford and a couple in Telford and a few in Rochdale, but in reality, it's the biggest attack on the British people that we've ever had in the history of our nation. Like, the only thing that comes close was the Viking raids, where they were coming in and obviously raping and killing people. But since then, because we're an island, and even in Europe, to be fair, it hasn't really happened. You just don't get like this influx of people coming in and targeting the locals because they're local, and singling them out for violence and and rape and slavery. Actually, it's sexual slavery.
And like the other side of that as well is like, uh, um okay, we have the record of the Vikings that they have done this, and they have done this massacres and rapes and stuff like that. Then that becomes an overall statistic, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't go into, okay, they did like, okay, whatever, to 50,000 people. What each individual
Mm.
has a story, or each individual victim of that
Mm-hmm.
has a separate story, and they get lost as a matter of statistics, right?
Yeah.
So either we dismiss these girls as, oh, there might be just few of them, and or they were asking for it, as some people say as well, or they were like, they did it themselves or whatever, like, they were from those households or whatever. Either we dismiss it like that, or we dismiss it as is so big that we just
Mm.
can't comprehend it. So there's not individual stories, but doing like an archive makes each survivor's voice heard, because there's also victims who haven't lived through this, right? Who have died, who have either committed suicide or were killed by those people after rape. And those people's stories can be expanded upon. Anything that we can find like that, Holocaust museum as well, like, each what happened to this person, any court
Mm-hmm.
document related to them, how they were mishandled, any police reports, and like, everything is there for people to actually see and pull out the data for it and understand
Yeah.
the situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's it. And that's why an archive is so much more, I think, more important than an inquiry, because it allows people to interact with the stories, with the, I mean, the data, if the researchers want to come in and look at that sort of stuff. But yeah, it allows the public to really get a full understanding of what happened and how it happened and why it was allowed to happen. What went so horribly wrong in this country that thousands of our girls were raped. So, so that's kind of the basic idea. But then, of course, it got even bigger because people went, well, like the girls don't get any support. And I was like, yeah, I do know that actually. So then people said, well, why didn't you do that as well? So now we're also doing like, Emily and Jacob are like working on creating some sort of center for therapy, so that the girls can start to, and boys, there are some boy survivors, can start to, come to terms with what happened, to work through those feelings, to come out the other side ultimately, and to rebuild their lives. And then people went, oh, but what about the communities? And I was like, yeah, no, we should definitely sort out the communities too. So we're partnering with something called the Care About Foundation, and what they do is essentially ground up community building. And it's all about empowering people who are living in places, where the gangs have essentially taken over and the councils and police are corrupt, and giving them the tools that they need to start to rebuild their own communities, to hold people to account, and then to run it properly themselves. So it's not, so it's kind of, grown, I guess, but in ways that are needed, because nobody else, as far as I can see, is doing this kind of work. To really kind of figure out, like, really get to grips with like what the happened and why and how, and then to actually then start to try and fix it, because it's no good just finding out. It's, you also then have to do something with that.
Yeah, and we have to see the what were the system failures, because that's where we can pull out the data. It's like, how did the system fail these girls? Why did it fail these girls? For whatever, like, there are multiple reasons. It's not just because labor were like in labor council that they were trying to get Muslim votes and stuff, but there are actually layers and layers and layers of issues
Yeah.
all around the country that are connected to it. Once you start getting the stories, once you start getting the collecting more data, you can map it out, and it's not just anecdotal, then it is actually evidenced, which is why I think so it's important. Also, I think so it helps to understand the patterns, right? To understand,
Hmm.
okay, never again, that never again point, these are already happening. So where are these fail? How can we help the girls which is happening right now to them? How can we stop it from happening in the future? I think so that those patterns are also built, which is why I think so it's very important to go with a archive. So now some people would say, well, there's also already a national inquiry happening, and there's Rupert Low's independent inquiry as well happening. Why do we need to do this? It will be dealt with, whatever finding we have, and it will be dealt with over there. Why do we need this? um
Yeah. I mean, it is because it is so multifaceted. Okay, so an inquiry, first of all, anything run by the government is going to be a whitewash because they
mhm,
are complicit. So they're never going to release a report that says, yes, we have broken the law, we should go to jail. Obviously, it's just going to happen. And we're already seeing, like where the police have been tasked with like going through their own files, they just redact everything. So, they're never going to throw themselves like into a jail cell, obviously. So that's just a complete, I didn't even, when people were saying let's campaign for a national inquiry, I was like, why? It won't do anything.
yeah,
And even worse
especially
than
under
that,
labor.
yeah, exactly. And even worse than that, like if there is a national inquiry and they have a report, then anybody else who says, well, actually, we still haven't fixed this problem, they can go, yeah, but we've got a national inquiry, so we've done it, so that's finished, so let's
Yeah.
just forget about it and move on, right? So I was like, you're actually harming the girls by calling for
Mm,
a national inquiry. It's not going to fix the problem. So there's that. Rupert Lowe's one. So I'm on the panel for Rupert Lowe's, and I think that having an independent inquiry is better than a government inquiry.
mm,
But as I was saying, the problem with an inquiry is that it's limited. Like, there's only so much you can actually do in a year, which I
mm,
think is the time frame he wants to do it
yeah.
in. There's only so many people you can talk to, and all they're ever going to get is very headliney kind of answers. It's because Labour wanted the votes.
Mm,
It's because Islam allows people to take sex slaves.
mm,
But what it actually is all of these things and more. And the only way we'll ever get to really finding out how these things interact, how they influence each other, how some of them became excuses for others, all that kind of stuff, is by really trying to find every scrap of evidence that has ever existed and is still in existence that we can get hold of,
yeah.
and then keeping it on record
Mm,
for as long as it takes for people to comb through it all and find everything in there.
yeah.
And I mean, that's like a multi-decade project. That's not an inquiry. That's not a year.
Yeah.
So,
and
so
and that
that's
does
why,
and
yeah.
that does the survivors and victims like proper justice as well, that
Mm.
there's an acknowledgement of their story, that they're not just making it up, or they're not just exaggerating, that this actually did happen. You can't just look away now from it. This has happened, and this is how many people it has happened. So what you're saying, like thousands of girls are lying? Obviously not.
Right.
And it's like, that's where I guess like the archive becomes complementary rather than in competition with anything, because it's like we need that inquiry of what Rupert Lowe is doing. We need that, like, for the acknowledgement, for the
Mm.
overall acknowledgement. We do need that independent inquiry. uh, but like, obviously it has a shelf life, and if it can be absorbed in the future, like that work, into an archive, then all the better, because then it becomes complementary. It's like, okay, you've done your job, but this is like, we're going to keep on building the record over here.
Mm-hmm.
And from that record that we're collecting, future private prosecutions can happen, right? um of the certain members of the police, certain members of the local council, or whoever it might be, because the evidence will be there, evidence will be collated, so that can be used as well. I guess that's how people should view it. Inquiry
But
and the archive, that is kind of complementary to each other. It can help each other, like, rather than be in competition, or one person wanting control of one thing or the other.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think that they are very different things. Obviously there is overlap in that we're both talking to survivors, but I mean that's about as far as it goes, really, because what we're doing is, the inquiry is a political project ultimately, because Rupert Lowe is a politician, and because
Mm,
inquiries are. So, um, that is to get, as I say, very immediate, sort of short term, like what can we do right now answers. The archive is a long term, really deep dive into the deeper questions behind it. So I'll give you an example, right? So somebody recently said to me, why didn't the councils do anything about it when they understood that this was happening? Is it because they were afraid of being called a racist? And I went, well, yeah, that's the surface level headline reason. But then you have to ask yourself, well, why were people scared of being called a racist, right? If
mhm,
you're not a racist, and you have evidence that this is actually happening, which both of which were true, in a country in which is running properly and which the courts are honest and the police are honest, then you would take the evidence and you would give it to the police and courts and you would say, look, I'm not a racist. Here's the evidence. Prosecute those guys. Okay. So so first of all, it tells you that we don't have honest police and courts because they were afraid that that wouldn't happen. They didn't feel
Mm,
that they could rely on the courts to exonerate them from this charge of racism. Secondly, why has the word racist become so toxic? Right, this is a question that nobody has really asked yet, as far as I'm aware, and no one really has a good answer to. Now, some of it is going to be to do with like the neo-Marxist woke nonsense. Some of it is going to be to do with like the open societies. We came out of this World War II where everybody realized that how badly wrong racism can go and what the consequences can be. So let's like shy away from that as far as we can
mm,
get. And so so a lot of it's like cultural. Some of it is to do with like guilt. They were white guilt. They were sort of
mm,
white guilting people into things. So again, it's a very complex problem, right? It's not just they were afraid of being called racist. There's like layers and layers
yeah.
behind that charge that all led to these girls being ignored. And so an inquiry can't dig into those layers, but an archive can, because we can build up a full picture of exactly what happened from all angles and then spend decades pulling those threads apart again. So ultimately it's an academic project, but academic in the best sense, in that we're really trying to fully understand everything we can about what happened here. And ultimately, if I do my job right with this archive, or we do our jobs right with this archive, what I actually want uh to foment is total societal change, right? If we get the answers to these questions, then we can say we don't just need like a new law that says grooming is bad. We need to radically rethink from the bottom up, like academia, the part that the universities played in promoting white
Mhm.
guilt and woke nonsense. We need
Exactly.
to radically rethink our whole local government
Mm,
structure, because clearly right now it's allowing a lot of corruption to go on. We
mm,
need to totally rethink policing and how that works, because
mm,
again, right now it's allowing
mm,
corruption. So, the reason that I so want to do this project, and that I'm so like almost evangelical about getting to the root of the grooming gangs, is because it touches everything in our lives that has gone wrong in this country. All of us suffer because the police are corrupt, because it means that when your house is burgled, they don't come out to see you. All of us suffer because the councils are corrupt, because the roads are being
mm,
left to go into
mm.
ruin. So so it is the key to unlocking everything that this country has become that's bad, and getting it back to being in a place where we can live free, open, and honest lives again.
Yeah, and it helps us be precise in what we are angry about as well, right?
Mm.
Because an inquiry or just posting online about just comments and reactionary comments can get people angry and wild up and riled up, and they will wake up, right? But if there's no direction, if there's no precise direction for them to coordinate their anger, their displeasure, it
Hmm.
can disrupt everything, right? It can self-destruct in a very weird way, right? Like these are the things, if they go unnoticed and uncared for, they go towards civil unrest and civil wars and stuff like that. So if we understand exactly how it can be fixed, by understanding exactly what levels of things went wrong,
Hmm.
then we can, like, have task force, or like, a particular precise ways of dealing with it without wasting resources, and directing people's frustration appropriately, right? So I think, like, yeah, this is why the first time when you talked about the archive with me, and you were like, oh, maybe it would be a good idea. That's like, no, no, we need to we need to go bigger. This is the idea. Like, this is really good. That's why I was like on at the first time. It's like, yeah, and we need to do it. And so But a project like this, a long-term project like this, needs investment and funding as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen in recent times, different people have come up with different projects and stuff, which has captured the public imagination a bit more, which are a bit like, sexy topics, so to speak, like creating a new party or creating a new,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like a pressure group like Restore Britain and stuff. They all have their merits and demerits accordingly. That's not the point, that's not the concern or the point. But how do we get the funding for it? How do we see public interaction with it? Is it the public does need, like, I would urge people, if you do support this project, go on our website, which I will put the link over here right now, and I'll remember what time I need to put the link on. Go on there and register your interest, at least, so that we know that you help, that you're supporting us. And then, when we ask for funding, then, like, think about it, fund us as well. But maybe in the future this could also be something that is supplemented by public funding,
Mm.
because a lot of these projects are in different ways, different countries and stuff, like the Holocaust memorials and stuff, because it actually helps the people, the public over there might have a better government in after 2029, or a different government that might be more receptive to the idea of
Yeah.
uncovering the truth. But how do you see it? Like, how do you see the funding right now, the issues right now for it, and the need for, and the necessity for it? Because people, like, not everyone, like, you need funding to run these sort of projects. It can't
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
be, run on
Yeah. Yeah.
charity.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Like, I think, I mean, the reality is that any startup struggles to get funding ultimately. Because, in the early days, it's like, well, show us what you've got.
Mm,
So we are working quite hard at the moment, as you know, to already start to put out what we can, working with a team of volunteers. And we're making some good progress, and there'll be more to come in the next few weeks. But yeah, so I think ultimately we're going to end up getting income from a number of different streams. One of them will be government, public, like crowdfunding. So I think, hopefully, even from what I've said, people can see the value in the project. And I'm sure once we start releasing testimonies and, looking at research and all that sort of stuff, putting out research, they'll see it more. And they will be minded to say, okay, we can see this is a good project and it's needed, and that it's getting results, because ultimately this is about the results that come out of it in terms of improving the country. So I'm hoping that people will support us in any way they can, even if it's just £5 or £5 a month or whatever. So that's one of the things. Um, Another is academic funding. So we are already starting to talk to universities and grants bodies about giving us funds to run particular research projects.
mm,
Because you can ask like a question, like, and it can be quite specific. What is the interplay between like woke and the public sector or something like that, and then you can get like a grant to research that sort
mm.
of question. So the difficulty there at the moment, as you've just said, is that all of the institutions that hand out those kind of grants are woke, right?
Yeah.
So we need to really think carefully about how we frame these questions so that they're unlikely to
Mm,
kind of go like, oh, you can't ask that because it'll destroy us, right? So so again, like that, to be honest, is also a plea from me to the public to say, look, we're really up against it, because other woke organizations can easily get government funding,
mm.
charities funding, academic funding. I mean, Emily Blesser was like, why don't we just go to the Arts Council? And I just started laughing, because I was like, they're not going to fund us to do
And
arts
this
projects.
is, people also need to understand, this is the reason why those institutions go woke as well, because they need to maintain their funding,
Hmm.
whether they believe in it or not. That's how they get trapped.
Right. Right. And we definitely aren't going woke. So,
Mm,
so yeah, so I guess at the start, we're going to rely quite heavily on public donations. Um, But as you say, hopefully sooner or later a better government will come along. They might give us a larger sum to.
Mm,
That's when we'll be moving into wanting to have buildings and have research places, and as I say, like the Center for Therapeutic Research, so that we can help find the
mm,
best ways to support people who have had sexual abuse in childhood, and all that. So that's kind of like the more longer term aim. But yeah, the other thing that I'm doing actually this week is trying to talk to American institutions, because the Americans are they have a more philanthropic culture,
mm,
so they're much more ready to, they're more readily give money to people such as ourselves. And B, I think that the Americans are really, most of them have a really strong heart for Britain, and feel terrible about how badly our country has gone wrong in the last few decades. You see that from like the Trump and the Vances and all that kind of stuff, like saying like, "Hey guys, sort out your free speech problem."
yeah.
So I think I think American funds may be going to be easier to secure for us than British. But yeah, I mean, we are looking at a lot, and I guess we'll end up selling like merchandise at some point, because we have to make an income. So the plastic bracelets that people wear to
Mm,
show their support and all that kind of stuff. We'll do it tastefully, guys.
mm,
The Holocaust Museum, my fiance and I joke about it a lot. The Holocaust Museum has a gift shop, and we're always like, what do you buy in the Holocaust Museum gift shop? You know? So, like a bit of brick from Auschwitz, like, how does that
yeah.
work? But, they sell books and they sell,
Mm,
I don't know, the usual stuff.
yeah.
So we can do something like that. And actually, again, like the arts projects that will come into that quite strongly, because one of the things we're already doing is looking at compiling a book of poetry that's written by survivors about their
Mm,
experiences.
mm,
Now, obviously, we will be able to use that to bring a bit of revenue in as well. So there's
mm.
lots and lots of different streams. And hopefully, I mean, certainly it will all be very tastefully done, I promise.
Yeah, and obviously, hopefully, the public can see that it's in the benefit of
Yes.
survivors. So, and there are a lot of them that needs help. Their families as
Yeah.
well, and it's needed. And no government is going to fully help them. They're only gonna try to push the dirt under the rug. They're not really interested in people, and people are, I think, some in Britain more and more are seeing this, that the government are not really their friend, right? So
Yeah.
they, since the Second World War, there has been this concept of the welfare state building more and more and more, but now that spell is breaking, where people are saying, okay, they only want to control us. So the
Hmm.
more they see that, the more like Americans they are becoming, where they are in, like, they are giving money to these organizations. You've seen, like, with even with Rupert Lowe, how quickly he was able to get that money for
Yeah.
the inquiry. That shows that people understand now that, okay, if we want something, we have to activate it. So hopefully
Yeah, and to be honest,
that is
like
the spirit we take.
the ethos of the entire project is exactly that, right? This is why, again, like we partnered with Care About, because what they are doing is specifically training people to take personal control of their
Hmm,
lives, personal responsibility for themselves and their
hmm,
communities, and to start to improve them. So the whole thing is part of that. Like, ultimately, as I say, what we want to get to is a society that doesn't just look the other way when girls are being raped, but that does step in and say, you can't do
hmm,
that to our girls, and we're going to make
yeah.
sure that you don't. So, all of this is about all of us
Hmm,
taking personal responsibility for each other, for our country, for our communities, for our children. And yeah, ultimately, funding is going to be a part of that as well.
yeah. Okay, so you can find the Twitter page of the archive at Archive for Truth, four as in the number four,
Yep.
truth. I'll put that in the description as well. And the website is, what was the website called?
It's
I keep forgetting it.
thesurvivors.co.uk.
Yeah, it's very simple. I don't know why I keep forgetting it. Survivors.co.uk, which will be in the description as well. And where can people find you on Twitter?
I'm Donna underscore Rachel underscore.
Okay, lots of underscores. I'll
Yeah,
put that in the description as well.
thank you.
Thank you for coming on, and I
Thank you.
hope we'll get to talk soon as well. We are supposed to do an X space as well. So
Yeah.
that will be interesting. So hopefully people can also, if more people join Archive for Truth on Twitter, we can do spaces over there, and you can put in your questions as well, and you can get sort of regular updates on what's going on and what's not going on. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and
Mhm.
yeah, and talking about the National Archive. And I'll see you next time, everyone. Thank you.